6 tips to be a better dungeon master, including one that Wizards of the Coast doesn't want you to know about. Let's talk some game master advice. But first, welcome to my first long form video ever and to my dungeon of a basement. GM or DM advice is always tough because everyone has their own style and literary voice when it comes to the games they run. I personally also hate advice that's overly broad or requires tons of work to apply. So I put together a list of 6 tips that you can use now that require very little work and will dramatically increase the quality of your games. Tip number 1, run a session 0. This is by far the easiest, most simple way to run a better game from the very beginning. It requires very little work, no artifice, no tricks. You don't have to buy anything, download any software, or change your brain chemistry. It just works. Quick side note, some people are really against session 0s for some reason, and I don't quite understand. But before you run to the comments, please hear me out first. Have you ever been in a D&D game where the characters aren't really connected to the setting? They aren't really connected to the campaign, they have no stakes in it, and have zero reasonable connection to each other. It's just a mix of memes, over-serious characters, and that one person that brought a 32-page backstory that has no connection to the plot whatsoever. That's because you did not have a session 0. So what is a session 0? It boils down to this: before a single die is rolled, before anybody puts pencil to paper about their characters, and before a single solitary hijinks is had, you devote an entire session briefing your players about the setting, the types of stories you want to run, the type of characters that might exist in it, and what you expect from your players in terms of how everyone is supposed to act at the table. Your players in turn get to ask you questions about the setting, request modifications, and tell you what they expect from you as their dungeon master. Then, and only then, do your players start making their characters with your help. And as they're making their characters together, they can start linking together their backstories and linking their backstories to the setting that you just described to them, coming up with a fully rounded character and fully rounded group. Whenever I teach anybody anything about D&D, I always give examples because that's how my brain works. Let's do an example of what this might look like in the context of your session 0. Say one of your characters wants to be a bookworm wizard. You can say that a town near the starting location of this adventure is known for its incredible wizarding school, and they could have been a student. You can then start giving some details about that wizarding school, like the type of people that went there. You can talk about the town that it's in, and you can bring up organizations that might be coexisting in that same town. You might even bring up that there is a thieves guild that is really popular and sometimes butts heads with the wizarding school. Now one of your other players that wants to play a rogue can pipe in and say, hey, I would like to be a thief. Maybe I could be from that thieves guild. Now you have 2 characters that are connected to a place and potentially to each other. They just have to flesh it out more. Perhaps they were childhood friends. Maybe the wizard caught the rogue trying to break into the school so they can pilfer some really cool magical ingredients to sell on the black market. Or conversely, maybe that rogue was the wizard's connect to get some really hush-hush materials for an unapproved spell that potentially got them kicked out of school, and that's why they're an adventurer now. So now those 2 players have characters that are connected to the setting and to each other. But why do we care as the dungeon master? The reason that we care about this is now those players and their characters are grounded in the story that we are telling. We can set up stakes that they understand, and we can draw from their backstory to create plot hooks that they're really going to enjoy in the future. Tip number 2, do not create situations that are single point failures. This is the number 1 mistake I see DMs make with their campaigns. You hide some campaign critical item, rumor, NPC, or whatever MacGuffin behind an arbitrary check, and invariably, your party manages to fail on that check and they have nowhere else to go. Let me give you an example of how this happened to me once. I was in a game, we had been exploring this dungeon for a session or 2. We get to a big mithril and adamantine door with just 1 keyhole in it. We've gone through all the rooms up to this point, and we had never found a key. It was unpickable, resistant to all magic, and could not be forced open. Finally, after about an hour, we had to ask the DM what was going on because we could not figure out this puzzle. They then nervously had to tell us that we had yet to find the key. So we had to go room by room, searching repeatedly until one of us happened to make a DC 25 investigation check in the correct room, and we found a secret compartment in a chest that we had already looked inside of. We wasted half a session looking for it, and nobody had any fun retreading that whole dungeon, searching for something that honestly should have just been given to us. That was a single point failure. We couldn't continue without finding the key, so we had to find the key. There was no other option given to us. Single point failures lead to broken narratives and completely unfun situations. What do you do instead? I have a couple of options. Option number 1, just give it to your players. It would have been extremely reasonable and 100% natural to have found that key on the belt loop or around the neck of one of the bandits that we had killed earlier in this dungeon. It makes more sense, honestly, when you have to think about the fact that these bandits and skeletons must have been traversing this dungeon somehow, right? When something is campaign critical to progress, just make it easy to find. Option number 2, give multiple avenues for success. If we could have picked the door open, forced it open, or used magic, or taken a more perilous path, we would have. Allow for these things when they make sense. They don't have to be the most optimal option, and maybe they may come with an additional cost or a risk, but that is way more interesting than just waiting outside of a door until your dungeon master tells you forgot something, or having to retread an entire dungeon looking for some stupid key. Option number 3 is actually my third tip, which is failing upward. It's not just for trust fund chads. It's a really good way to keep your campaign moving and maintaining drama. Just think about it. Statistically speaking, your players are bound to fail some of their rolls some of the time. Failure must never be a dead end. It must move the story forward just as much as success does. Let's do a new example. The party is trying to sneak into a bandit fortress and have reached a locked door. The rogue rolled a 7 but needed a 15 to successfully unpick it. Instead of telling them the boring thing, which is just saying it doesn't unlock, you can describe how the lock is taking much longer than expected and that the rogue, in their attempt, is maybe making a lot more noise than they usually do with the scraping of their tools inside of the lock. When they finish the door, it opens, but not because they unpicked it, but because a bunch of bandits rush out of it. The bandit guards overheard the rogue's mediocre attempt at picking the lock and are now going to try and teach them a lesson. If the party succeeds in this surprise combat, they have access to inside of the bandit fortress, but maybe less resources, hit points, spell slots, whatever, than they may have hoped, a cost if you will, and if they lose the combat, they can get lugged inside as prisoners, and now they have to find a way to escape. Both of these options are way more exciting, both as a player and narratively, than being stuck outside of a door, and the story keeps on moving forward. Before I get to my next tips, I want to take a minute to thank our sponsor for this episode, the Shop of Many Things. They sent me a goodie bag full of a bunch of really cool stuff, like these Ascendice magical floating dice. It's floating there with magnets, which are magic. They also sent me some really cool pens. These are perfect for in-game items and for making clues because they have magically disappearing ink, but not in the way you think. If you apply a little heat from a flame to the ink, it disappears. Quick interruption. I did not read all the packaging on those pens. The ink disappears with fire, but it's supposed to come back with ice. I don't know if I believe that, so we're going to test it right now. I've got that same clue that I made. We're going to put it in my freezer. Clue. And now, I'm going to give it like 5 minutes. We'll see what happens. It worked! Holy shit, that was working. I checked this a few minutes ago and it was starting to maybe come back a little bit, but it's actually like fully filled in for the most part. Hey, that's pretty cool. So I convinced them to give out $3,000 worth of these pens. So to get that deal, whenever you make your order, use the code RUN_DMG, all caps, or use a convenient link also in the description and they will be in your cart. They are really cool, definitely worth trying out. Now let's get back to the other tips. Tip number 4, use safety tools. I'm not gonna get all preachy on you about it. It's just another tool that people can use to increase the quality of their games that other people, for some reason, get really angry about. And before you call me a soy boy in the comments, just please hear me out first. Firstly, what are safety tools? They come in a lot of different forms, and some of them you may have already heard of, things like lines and veils, sensitivity checklists, X cards. Their purpose is either to figure out what people want and don't want to experience during play before you actually start rolling dice, and or giving people tools to augment or stop play as it's happening if they feel uncomfortable. I could come up with a couple explanations as to why I think this is important, but I find it's really easy to come off preachy and a little condescending, especially when you're talking to people that maybe don't use safety tools. So I'm going to read the explanation as to why safety tools are a good practice from the Horror Game Mothership's Warden Manual. I love this game and I love this take. Safety in gaming is about hospitality. If I were to invite you over to my house for dinner, I would work with your dietary restrictions. In conversation, you could be sure that racism, slurs, transphobia, homophobia, bigotry of any kind would be unacceptable at my table. You would know that you would not be shamed or mocked by the other guests for the way that you look, the way that you dress, the things that you believe. This grace would be extended to you and expected of you. In short, while under my roof, I would do everything in my power to make sure you were safe. And we wouldn't always get it right. This is the important bit. Sometimes I wouldn't realize until later that I or someone else had said something stupid or insensitive, and for that I'd hopefully apologize and we figure out how to not end up in that situation again next time. But we all accept that these things happen because we want to be around other human beings and we don't expect perfection from them. Playing a horror game is like that. You need to be graceful and understanding, and you need to listen to the other players. In addition to all the other social requirements of being a human in a shared space with other humans, you need the most basic human requirement of kindness. Hospitality has been with us since we traveled in packs and lived in caves. It's a way to say, under this roof, friend or stranger, you are safe. There is nothing more important in gaming than this. This is from the Warden's Manual for Mothership, an incredible game and an incredible take. Final note on safety tools. They work both ways. Yes, your players are telling you what not to put in your campaign, but simultaneously, they're also telling you the things that they really, really want to see in this campaign, making your job even easier. Another way that it also works both ways is that if there's something that you as a DM really don't like to do, you can get rid of it. For example, I hate narrating like intimate, romantic, or sexual scenes between NPCs or my players. It gives me the ick. It's really weird when 5 people are staring at you and you have to like narrate this Harlequin romance novel type stuff. It's gross and weird. I don't like it, so I don't allow it in my games. In that way, safety tools protect everybody's interests at the table. Tip number 5. Do not prep more than a session or 2 ahead. I'm not going to tell you to not prep a thing or become an improv DM overnight, but just prep less. Before I became an improv DM, I would write out so much material, dozens of pages of notes in hopes that I could cover weeks worth of sessions and would immediately get shredded by my players doing something incredibly reasonable in the course of play. All that effort would be wasted, and I would get incredibly frustrated, and that would lead me to be burning out a bit as a dungeon master, and it kind of made me not want to be one anymore. Burnout is an extremely common problem amongst dungeon masters. It happens all the time, and it's because you sink so much time into doing this prep. You move things around in your life. You block off weekends. You make your life harder doing all this prep in hopes that your future will be a little bit easier. And then when it comes time to cash out all of that effort, it's all for naught and it all goes in the trash can, and it leaves you so frustrated. It's very creatively punishing as well. Another thing that tends to happen is because you spent so much time working out your plots, you've written dozens of pages, you begin to consciously or unconsciously push your players towards actions that best fit the material you've already written, really limiting their choices and putting them on a bit of a railroad. To prevent all this, just keep it simple, only prep a session or 2. You can of course, take some time, write out your big overarching plot, but don't get into the nitty-gritty of it. Keep it simple. If you're the type of DM that always has to be writing, then focus on your world building. Build out your NPCs' backstories, create organizations, create towns and countries and the politics between them. All of these things are really evergreen and can be pulled back into the game at any point. And if they're not used in this game, they can be used in the next campaign. We've made it to the clickbaity tip. The tip that Wizards of the Coast doesn't want you to know about. Tip number 6. Play other games. I became a better DM when I started playing and running other games. Point blank, period. There are so many tabletop RPGs out there. All of them have their own unique systems, ideas, and vibes that you can learn from and use to build your own style. D&D is a ton of fun, and it is good at a lot of things, but like anything, it has its strengths and its limitations. For example, I always felt really weak when it came to court politics, intrigue, social encounters in D&D. And when I looked for guidance from the books, I really couldn't find anything that helped me in any measurable way. Then I started to play Vampire the Masquerade, which is laser focused on that, and I felt those things get a whole lot easier. I learned from the game, I learned from the play, I learned from the mechanics, and my storyteller, and I brought all that back to the D&D games that I run. I won't make any claims that I'm an expert at social encounters and role-playing with my characters, but I feel like I'm a whole lot more comfortable with it, and I feel like my players can feel that too. And because I know how to explain these concepts from my own point of view a little bit better, I can now teach my players about some of these things as well. And I feel like we all have a better grasp about how to role play and for that role play to feel fun and satisfying in the context of the game. Another game that I greatly enjoy and I feel like has really taught me a lot is Brindlewood Bay. It is a super rules light, powered by the Apocalypse game about crime-solving grannies a la Murder, She Wrote. It is about as far away from D&D as physically possible. My favorite part of it is its central mechanic, which is how you actually solve the mystery. its mysteries that come with the book don't come with a set outcome or a specific killer. It's a list of prompts and a list of clues connected to the murder, but not connected to any one person or location. Your players choose where and who to investigate, and then that leads to clues being found. They then link those clues to particular people, and once they find enough clues, they can string them together and decide the narrative of how the murder happened. It then all boils down to a roll, and if they roll high enough, that is exactly how the murder happened. It's kind of like figuring out a mystery backwards. Because it's so rules light and because the adventures themselves have very little actual guidance about what happened, it's an extremely improv and roleplay heavy game. And it taught me so much how to do those things way, way better. And I also learned a really cool mechanic about mysteries that I can now implement in my D&D games. So what do you think about the tips? Have you heard of these before? And have you used any of them in your games? And did you notice an improvement? I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you have any questions or anything you want me to go more in depth with, let me know. I can do a short or maybe another long form video, which I'm trying to do more of. Also, this is my first time doing a long form video, and I'm sure I did a ton of stuff wrong. So if you have any feedback or critiques, let me know. In the meantime, roll well, be well.